The late Showa era for Japan was a very interesting time for the country. World War II had ended, and everyone was in a fervor to get the country and the economy back on track. By the late 1950s and early 60s, Japan was making an incredible recovery. It seemed like everyone was making money. By 1964, Japan held its first Olympics since the war and debuted the Shinkansen, or bullet train. Highways were popping up everywhere. Japan was churning out its own industries, pulp culture, and entertainment by this time. And although much of it still mimicked the Western cultures, especially during the occupation, Japan started to develop its own flair and style. Fashion began to make its mark in big cities like Tokyo. Women started to gain a sense of freedom for the first time since the days of the feudal lords of the samurai. Everybody was busy doing something. Everyone had a great sense of pride. Everyone felt that for the first time since the war, Japan was making a comeback. While at this time, Tokyo and Osaka were representing the main industrial and cultural might of Japan at the time, small towns began to flourish as well, especially resort towns. Weary businessmen who worked nearly 24/7 and students who study equally as long would go back to their hometown to relax, and thus helping the local economies. One such countryside, about an hour and a half outside of Tokyo, was a small, mountainous resort town, often called the Snow Country. The reason they call it the Snow Country is because from December to late March, it snows nearly every day. In the old days, it snowed so much that the people had to exit their homes through the roof. During those 3 to 4 months, children would stay at the schools 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, until the snow receded. One of the early Shinkansen lines was slated to go through this town. The reason for the Shinkansen passing through this town was because it was the very first town in all of Japan to have a ski resort. It is also known for its onsens, or hot spring spas, an ideal spot to relax and play. It was such a success, it brought hundreds and thousands of people from Tokyo to this small town, the hometown of Masako. The Snow Country, despite being a beautiful resort town tucked in the mountains outside of Tokyo, held a variety of dark secrets, some of them small, some of them quite severe. One example is the railway that went through the small town. Originally built to transfer people from Tokyo to the countryside before the bullet train was created, the railway system cost many people their lives. Much of the construction was built around the Second World War, so slave labor was used to make the bridges that ran through the town. Some of those bridges collapsed, crushing many of the workers working on the bridge. They were simply buried under the pillars of the bridge without any kind of proper ceremony. It is said that ghosts still linger around those pillars even today. Because it snows so much in this part of the country, the only way to get from one town to another was by either taking the train itself or walk along the thoroughly plowed tracks, as any other way would have been buried by snow. The train engineers of the time would often find body parts caught and mangled within the train system. Late at night, there was no way for anyone to see these people walking down the tracks, and since there was no way to escape the tracks when the train came along, each side of the tracks having a wall of snow at least 4 meters, death was instantaneous. The engineers often complained about having to clean up such an unpleasant ordeal, as anyone could imagine. Other small things throughout the town seemed to be known only to the locals. Things like the suicide rate being abnormally high. Seemingly happy, wealthy people would suddenly hang themselves. for no reason at all, their ghosts often lingering around the location of the suicide. When the snow thawed in spring, bodies would be uncovered from murders that took place in Tokyo. Apparently, the deep snow made it ideal for murderers to discard bodies within the mountains. The local schools were built on former samurai grave sites. Children reportedly seeing ghosts during study time or reading time within the schools. While many of these events were well known within the community, it was obvious to the people of the town hall to keep this kind of information quiet, as it may deter people to visit the town, tourism being the largest part of the town's economy. Most of the residents seemed to adjust and work around these incidents. During the bubble economy in the late Showa era, most people were too busy making money to worry about these kinds of things. Masako, who lived in the center of the town, was no different from anyone else. Her and her relatives were very much involved with the tourist side of the economy within the town. Masako herself was a hard-working, attractive woman who owned her own coffee shop. However, she was not so keen on being enslaved by the traditional side of a small community. With cities like Tokyo and Osaka booming with a freer lifestyle, she dreamed about leaving the town, especially during winter. Though she had many customers come to her coffee shop and she was well known within the community, as well as being relatively wealthy and successful from her business, she felt it wasn't her. She often told her relatives she dreamed of a freer lifestyle, someplace away from snow and winter, someplace warm in the south, preferably near the sea. By the late mid-70s, business was booming. During the winter season, Masako's cafe was filled with customers. Friends and family were there to help. She was actually doing quite well. Ski resorts were popping up everywhere. In fact, the snow country became one of the most well-known ski resort areas throughout Japan. Close to Tokyo, that meant hundreds and thousands of people visiting the small town every year. But this lifestyle didn't suit Masako. This wasn't for her. She wanted something different. And she was tired of the lackluster enthusiasm of the locals. They seemed to be interested only in profiting from the boom in skiing. As it was a small community, she knew everyone. And she was particularly tired of certain male customers that would come to the shop to hit on her. This she did not appreciate, to say the least. Being open in her conversation, she made it known to everyone that she was tired of the snow country and wanted to move to someplace warmer. However, she seemed somewhat powerless to make any changes in her life, perhaps because it was of her sense of duty towards her coffee shop. And certainly the people in the village were too unwilling or too busy to lend a hand for such an endeavor. However, late in the ski season, an unusual couple arrived late in the evening in the small town. Even though it was towards the end of the ski season, it was still snowing. However, these two people were not here for skiing. It was a man and a woman who had arrived in town. The man was a self-professed writer. He probably came to the town to try to pick up on the fame of author Kawabata Yasunari, who wrote the Nobel Prize-winning book entitled The Snow Country. However, this man's writing skills were very limited. No one bought his books. The woman with the man was his girlfriend, a young pretty thing, but with no talent or ambitions. She seemed to hang on to him simply because there was nothing better to do, somewhat like a groupie, hoping someday that all of his promises of fame and fortune would come true, and she could be a part of it. When they arrived, it was on a local train, not the Shinkansen. They stayed at the hotel where Kawabata Yasunari had written his book. They likely stayed there because they were looking for insights on how he was so successful. As it would happen, the couple visited Masako's coffee shop, and for some strange reason, the three of them hit it off well. Masako began to spend more and more time with the couple. Now, exactly what happened amongst the three is led to all kinds of rumors. But despite the warnings from family and friends, the three of them seemed to get along quite well. So much so, they spent more time together than with anyone else. Eventually, the three of them decided to head on south together. They liked Masako's ideas. They convinced Masako to sell the coffee shop and all of her belongings. And together they would start a new coffee shop somewhere down in the southern part of Japan in Fukuoka. There they could have a coffee shop, write books, and live happily ever after. Unfortunately, when she left, no one ever heard from her again. Of course, concerned family and friends asked the police to investigate when they lost contact with Masako. And the police looked high and low for years but found nothing. To this day, some people still believe that Masako lived happily ever after. She lived her dream. Most were doubtful, however. Most believed that something went awry. Something was just too suspicious about that couple. But since there was no proof to be found, most people just went on their way. It wasn't until many years later, something new had arisen. Something much darker than anyone could have imagined. Years had gone by. No one had heard from Masako again. The police gave up their search, and people went back to their lives. The story had been forgotten, and while most people believed she had met foul play, some still believed she was alive. But that was years ago. It was now the 1980s, the end of the bubble economy. Business started to slow down, and although skiers and snowboarders still visited the area, it wasn't like it was before. Many of the smaller slopes and businesses started to shut down. However, the economy of the area was still reasonably stable. By the late 1980s, an amateur photographer came to town. Though his skill was reasonably good, he wasn't professional enough to make enough money. He was attracted to the beauty of the small town, only an hour and a half away from Tokyo. He was fascinated by the culture, its quaint little village, the scenic mountains, the lifestyle, the history, and so on. But to make ends meet, he needed work. So he went to the town hall to see if there was anything available. Sure enough, there was work for teaching children and adults English. The townspeople seemed to like him a lot and hired him immediately. Since in his hometown it snowed a lot, he was very comfortable within the snow country. He felt it was very much like home. For several years, things went along as usual. He did his photography, he taught English classes, started to learn about the history of the town and surrounding towns, and was generally pleased with his work, its pay, and the people he worked with. While he did begin to notice some of the little ghost stories or the little strange happening that seemed to plague the town, he just shrugged them off as wives' tales or coincidences, as none of them seemed to be very severe or life-threatening. However, one day he encountered something very strange, something that would pull him into the paranormal and psychic world forever, something that changed his life. It was on a sunny, cold day. He was teaching children English, and he was playing with them, and they were all laughing and giggling, when suddenly, right in the middle of the class lesson, he froze. He couldn't speak, he couldn't move. He could see the children, he could see the other teachers, but he couldn't do anything. He just stood there for nearly 5 minutes, until one of the children came up to him and pulled his sleeve and asked him, "Are you okay?" He didn't snap out of it suddenly. He suddenly realized he was being pulled into someone else's soul. It was a woman. She was screaming for help. Behind her, he saw a man and a woman trying to pull her back. They wouldn't let her go. Because he was in the middle of a class, he shook himself as hard as he could, and the vision vanished. When he looked down, the entire classroom was staring at him, wondering if he was okay. He quickly pulled himself together, finished the class, but went straight home. When he got to his bed, he crashed and didn't wake up until the next day. He was shaken by the event, trying to figure out what was going on. Now, this photographer had an interest in the paranormal, and he had heard of kanashibari, or sleep paralysis, before, but he never heard of somebody standing in the middle of a classroom and suddenly getting an attack. Although he was frozen for only what seemed like an eternity, was 5 minutes, he started to process all of the images he saw in his mind's eye. He saw the elegant-looking woman, the man and his girlfriend pulling on her, and her screaming, trying to get out her name and what had happened. All he could get was masa, and that was it. Like a dream, the vision began to fade. But during his English classes in the evening with adults that have lived in the snow country all their lives, he began to ask questions about a woman that might have had gotten into some sort of trouble in the past. And the students asked, what was her name? And the minute he said Masa, they all said, oh, Masako. And he knew at that moment that is exactly who it was. Another season went by and the topic was dropped. No one seemed to have the real answer to what happened to Masako. It was said that she went down south. Masako's cousins believed she was still alive. The police found no evidence of anything, except all of her belongings, and Masako herself disappeared. Without any other kinds of encouragement from the community to pursue the issue, he let it drop. Just another local rumor, he thought. However, one day, while sitting at his desk, while doing his work, he got the same kanashibari, or sleep paralysis, he had at the school. But this time he was sitting down. He could feel Masako come around from behind, slip into his body, share his thoughts and visions. He saw Masako looking out over the ocean, smiling, almost laughing because she finally felt free from the snow country. But a few minutes later, she felt a scarf come around her neck and begin to squeeze tightly. She couldn't breathe. She began to cry. Somewhere in her consciousness, she knew these two people, the man and the woman, were bad news, but wanted to believe that they were going to help her be free. She could only choke. She could only think on how stupid she was, how naive, how sad it was for her life to end this way. The photographer wanted to move, wanted to shout, but he couldn't. Masako held him down firmly so he could see and feel it all. The vision shifted to Masako's body being moved into a shallow grave. Rocks were being placed upon her. Her soul had not left her body yet, and she felt the weight of the rocks. She was still crying inside her mind and her soul, even though her body was quite dead. Finally, she felt her soul leave her body. As soon as it left her body, it went racing back to the snow country, past her two assailants, past everything in lightning speed. She arrived back in the snow country to see her family, her cousins, the people of the town. And she began to wonder, what is she doing back here? What did she not see that led to her demise? She began to let go of the photographer, and her soul began to move out. The vision began to fade, and the last thing the photographer heard was Masako's voice saying, "Help me. This place is dangerous." The photographer didn't know what to do. He thought about going to Masako's cousins and family to talk about it, or to the police, but Masako prevented him from doing so. He later found out why. From that point forward, the photographer realized he could talk to Masako within his mind from time to time. She would occasionally warn him of the evil that was within the community. It took a while for the photographer to download all of this experience he had put into his soul and psyche, but he began to realize what was going on. This was a very small town. Some people made a lot of money, some people didn't. Those that made a lot of money seemed to do it always through some nefarious way. Thanks to Masako, the photographer began to feel and see what was going on with the community, what evil was really there. Some of the suicides that suddenly happened for no reason were always with somebody with money. People who disappeared, strange accidents, and the like all seemed to be around certain people, usually kind people with a little bit of money. And all that money ended up in someone else's pocket. The photographer finally caught on. There was a game going on here. Somebody had summoned something, and Masako was the first sacrifice. So the photographer went around all the kind people, the children, and everyone else, and in any way he could that wasn't strange or sounding hysterical, he warned them that there was something very dark in this town, and most of the townspeople knew of it. So instead of the townspeople outright ignoring him or laughing at him, some of the people, although very few, heeded his words and left the town. The photographer also left. He vowed to Masako that someday he would tell her story, so she would be remembered. She was grateful, as for some of the people who were still in the town she loved very much, and didn't want to see him succumb to this corrupt game. When the photographer could no longer stand being in that dark town, he finally left. Masako seemed to be content that enough was done. So in her own way, she thanked him. Though the photographer could never confirm any of this in the physical world, he was sure Masako was murdered by those two people, and they were awful on how they treated her and her body. On the way out, the photographer felt that Masako was probably still there, watching over her loved ones as a shugore, or guardian spirit, now wiser, stronger, and less naive than she was before. The photographer felt she would rest in peace when the game finally ended. The photographer would never forget the experience he had with Masako. Now, what makes this case so special? People go missing all the time. The main thing is that Masako was not just any desperate soul of low intelligence. She's actually quite a loving being. But she was also very free-spirited. She hated being locked into the lifestyle that was given to her in the snow country. But because she wanted to be free so much, she started to listen in her mind the wrong voices, the voices of entrapment. And this is very common with a lot of missing persons. So one of the first things when looking for a missing person to consider is, of course, their state of mind. However, it doesn't end there. Because Masako had made a lot of money, somebody else, including within her family, were very jealous of that fact, and in part helped summon the demon and her two assailants that pushed her in a direction to her demise. This is why, after she died, she immediately went back to the snow country in spirit form. It wasn't just the two assailants who were pulling the trigger of her death, so to speak. There were other people and other forces behind her death. This is why she didn't allow the photographer to go visit her family, as they were accomplices to the crime, though it is very unlikely you would ever find any physical evidence of that. The fact that the police were practically useless in this case tells a lot. Masako also didn't directly tell her whole story. She showed the photographer what she experienced. The reason she did this is because she wanted the photographer to come to the same conclusion she did, not by lying into his consciousness like had been done to her, but by allowing him to see the truth with his own judgment. So if anyone suddenly disappears, and of course this is not always the case, some of the other things you may want to look into are things like, did that person have money? Was that individual going to inherit a lot of money? Were there people secretly jealous of that individual's ability to love, their beauty, their lifestyle? The photographer learned something very important. Almost always, when a person mysteriously dies or disappears, it's not by pure accident. There is always something or someone pulling the strings. There always seems to be some individual somewhere, lurking in the shadows, benefiting from someone else's demise. And of course, there are the loved ones who are devastated by the loss and are totally innocent. So if anyone could learn anything from this example of missing persons, it is this. You can be targeted, and you will know when you are. Things will go wrong in your life. You could hear thoughts in your mind that would push you in a direction that you shouldn't do, that seem okay on the surface, but underneath are quite dangerous. People will always get little hints from their guardian spirits, but some people need to learn the lesson the hard way. This seemed to be the case with Masako, and that is nothing against her. She was not a stupid person. She was set up just like many other missing persons and mysterious deaths. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Please, if you have any questions, leave them in the comments section below. And thanks again for watching. Hope to see you in the next video.